If you look for it, you might be lucky enough to find a vista that makes you just want to stop and sketch a postcard, which is exactly why I put this pack of postcards in my art box. I could have used my regular sketchbook, and maybe that is what you would have used too. But if you're like me, you might also have an art supply addiction and like to try these new things. So we're going to sketch on a watercolor postcard today. As you can see, I have lots of pencils and a new set of Tombow watercolor markers. So I'm going to use a mixed media approach for this card. These colors seem like they'll work perfect for this landscape of oranges, pinks, and reddish purples. So I'm kind of excited to give them a try. This area is in the Capitol Reef National Park, and I didn't have a lot of time to do this because I snuck out early one morning before anyone would miss me back at the hotel. It was tempting to just drive around a bunch more, trying to find the perfect place, but I needed to find a quick place to park and paint in an area that was close, safe, and quiet. I didn't really want to be bothered by other tourists on this one. So I picked this area, off this gravel road. I particularly liked the purplish shadows that were being cast along those cliffs. This won't be a masterpiece, but it will be a great memory. Painting outside has become one of my favorite ways to experience a place. I hope you try it sometime too. And even though I said I didn't have much time, I spent about 45 minutes here. I like sketching with these Tombow markers. They're actually kind of fun because they lay down color so quickly. I mean, this is obviously sped up for you, but they do lay down really quickly. And in a bit, I'll use some water and a brush to blend them a bit more. I wanted to lay down the darker reddish purple to get the shadows in place, and I find it's a pretty good way to start. It's a good way to establish the feel of the composition more quickly. The darker shadows serve as anchor points for everything else. And then I started to add pinks and oranges for the lighter sunlit areas. The ground is reflecting the most light, so it's the lightest. The cliff walls are vertical, so they don't have as much sun hitting them as the ground does. So vertical things are often darker than the ground, which is horizontal. So the ground is going to be pinkish, and the sunlit cliff face is going to be orangish, because that's what those rocks are. And then in the foreground there are the green bushes, which I think is a really cool contrast color for this landscape. And it's also what attracted me to this place. That and the remote setting. I really like the wide open spaces. It's a pretty good way to spend a morning. These light and shadow contrasts and complementary colors usually make for a pretty good painting. There were some really amazing rock formations elsewhere in the park, but for this time in the morning, they didn't have the right light and shadow contrasts, so they would have been a bit harder for me to paint. Either way, these markers kept things bright, colorful, and loose, and I like that. I used some Inktense pencils for the sky. This was the iris blue color, which is one of my favorites. These pencils blend wonderfully with water. And I'm at an angle here and I got some drips, but that's okay. This watercolor card is pretty absorbent and the Tombow markers dried quickly, so it's not blending great, but good enough for a fun sketch. When I slow down and use the Inktense pencil again, I'll be able to get better blending results. It's a good way to layer over everything with this warmer yellow color. It will work almost like glazing. Working in layers is a pretty good way to approach this, and hopefully each layer will build on the previous ones to make a rich, interesting result. And next I'll try some non-water soluble pencils. So I get some light over the dark colors, because the non-water soluble pencils are a little bit more opaque. This lighter color works okay because I still have a little tooth in this paper, but that tooth fills up fast. A different surface or a higher quality watercolor paper would produce a much better result. That's the number one thing about using pencils and watercolor pencils. I believe the surface you are drawing on or painting on matters the most. And this paper isn't the best. It's okay for a sketch though. So with that expectation, I'm okay with the results I'm getting. But my frustration is building. This is a Derwent drawing pencil, and they have a very soft core, so they'll lay down a bit better than the previous lavender pencil I used. It was a different type. It had a harder core. This line of pencils, though, has a lot of earthy, muted tones. They will definitely work great here. This Mars orange seems appropriate for this landscape because it does sort of look like we're on Mars here. I knew I was coming to this place, so I brought the pencils and colors I thought would work best. I think both the markers and these pencils have been very appropriate colors for this landscape. So I'm switching back and forth amongst these pencil types to try to get the effect I wanted. I even switched back to the markers. I guess I was trying to get the shadows and textures to look right. I also was trying to put some depth into the scene by emphasizing that front rock outcropping, but the limitations of this paper is becoming really frustrating. Adding the lighter color on those background cliffs was an attempt to push them back visually, further into the distance, by perhaps drawing the air between them. This is called atmospheric perspective. I tried to do that in most of my paintings. All of the darker brown shadows was an attempt to show the ruggedness of those rocks. Drawing those bushes is harder than you think though. I tried to get the three-dimensional look, but also abstract enough that they look natural. At some point you just have to stop looking at the landscape itself and just start looking at what you're working on to make it look like a good painting rather than trying to replicate everything you're seeing. Either way, this is all really good practice. And I hope that somehow this inspires you to get out and practice sketching. If I can do it, so can you. Don't worry about perfection or mistakes. I've made plenty here, but overall I'm pleased with how it's turning out, despite the challenges of the paper. I'm finishing off these bushes with Inktense pencils. I think that was a good move. It really adds some pop to the landscape, and the Inktense works way better on the surface anyway. The green up front seems to help with the depth of the scene, so that's good too. I tried some red in the foreground. I find that drawing the ground closest to me is actually hard to get right, so I'm trying some different techniques here, like pulling the paint off the pencil with a brush, kind of like a watercolor palette. I've also decided to try splattering the ink with some fun abstract effects. I always like when I see that on watercolor paintings. I've never really done that before. Kind of fun. The last thing I tried was some white gouache to highlight that rock cropping again. There's nothing that says I can't use lots of different media when I sketch. That gouache really does make the highlights stand out, but I think I don't want to leave it pure white. So I'm going to once again experiment with blending it with some orange Inktense color that I take straight from the pencil tip. That didn't work too great, but I suppose with more practice this might be a pretty decent trick. I just need more patience. I think next time I'd let the gouache dry a bit more before coloring over it. So I think I'm done exploring here, and I'm going to call this a really good art adventure. And I'll see you in the next video.